there has been an exciting regulatory development in the United States, and which pertains to food traceability, and the food products of which are very pertinent to the GDST members. We are excited about it because it is rooted in core concepts that the GDST is rooted in. And we feel that this is a strong regulatory framework for the GDST to play well in. So the purpose of this webinar is really to go over the rule and to show our technical analysis and the alignment between the regulation and between the GDST standards themselves. So we're doing this session today at a time zone that is amenable to North American and European companies. We're doing an additional, a very similar webinar tomorrow for Asia Pacific time periods. So I'm sorry, was there a question before we got started?
No questions so far.
Okay.
Thomas, are you going to record this in case we want to share it with anybody else at our company that isn't able to attend?
Yes, I said that I think just before you joined.
Oh,
we are recording it, and we're going to also have a little bit of discussion. So it's also for our references as well to be able to do that. If any of you are not familiar with myself, my name is Thomas Burke. I work at the Institute of Food Technologists, one of the organizations that co-convenes the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability, where at IFT, I am Senior Food Traceability and Safety Scientist, and for the GDST, I'm technical lead, and where I do a lot of the technical processes such as piloting, documentation creation, tool development, that sort of thing. So let's get started now that we've gotten some of that housekeeping out of the way. So the way I decided to go through the regulation is really to give an overview of the proposed rule, and I will use regulation and proposed rule somewhat interchangeably. Really, if you were being technically correct, it's proposed rule. Until it is finalized, you wouldn't necessarily call it a regulation, but bear with me on that. And then I will discuss the alignment with the GDST 1.0 standard, the technical exercise that we have undertaken as a secretariat, and I'll really show kind of on a technical level where I see that alignment. I'm not going to try to go into too much depth, but I do think it is very helpful for understanding the impact that the regulation has on GDST, and really also shows how powerful the GDST is in meeting, global regulatory considerations. And then I'd like to have a little bit of discussion about how you interpret the rule, how you see it, impacting your approach to GDST. And so I have some suggested topic areas, but we can we're not like a gigantic group, so we can kind of have it as a free-forming conversation as well. I think for the duration of my explanatory background of, going over the rule and going over GDST's alignment with it, I think it would be best if you have questions to put it in the chat. There is a lot of detail to go through, and it'll probably be better for us to kind of go through all of the questions and comments at the end rather than stopping at each juncture. But if there is something that is really unclear, or you'd like an additional explanation, do feel free to pipe in and let me know. So before I get into this, I kind of want to give a brief summary of what the GDST Secretariat is doing regarding the rule at the moment. So we've done this technical alignment analysis. I sent out this document when I sent the Zoom invite, the Zoom information, and then we are also participating in the FDA public meetings that they're running. They're having a series of 3, and actually they're having one today as well, where there's both interaction with the FDA staff and personnel that formed up the rule. And then there's also public comments, oral comments that are occurring in these public meetings. We are also conducting a pilot project which pertains specifically to the use of the GDST in the context of Section 204 or the proposed rule. And we are also engaging with the steering committee and you know, working through forming a process on submitting feedback. So we do realize, really the summary is we realize how much, how strong there is, how wide-ranging the implications are for this rule for GDST membership, and we are, you know, taking appropriate steps to understanding it and ensuring that it is that we have a thoughtful approach to its enactment. So this is a, you know, EU or Europe, North America time zone. So I am going to give a little bit of background on traceability regulation in the United States. So for some of you, this is probably information you may already know, but I will also kind of explain a little bit of the regulatory process in the United States and what this really means. So traceability really, from a regulatory lens, really took its biggest leap forward in 2002. You know, subsequent to the anthrax attacks in the United States, the United States felt that they needed to have a stronger protection of critical infrastructure, which included food. So the Public Health Security and Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Act really established that paradigm of one up, one down record keeping for FDA registered facilities. And that continues to this day, that regulation, the new proposed rule, the food traceability rule, does not cancel out those requirements. Those requirements are still in place for FDA registered facilities. These are really standards, or these are really a regulation that stands on top of the public health or the anti-bioterrorism record keeping requirements. In 2011, the Food Safety Modernization Act is signed. This is an enhancement to food safety regulation in the United States that's really building on top of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, really to take the food safety infrastructure of the federal government to really the modern age, and really to think about and really to move from more of a reactive model to more of a preventative food safety mindset, at least statutorily. Within Food Safety Modernization Act is a section called Section 204, which specifically pertains to the enhanced record keeping requirements for certain foods, for high risk foods. A important component of that was Section 204A, which had FDA deign a effort to understand the landscape of traceability in the United States. And in doing this, they commissioned the Institute of Food Technologists, the company that I work for, to conduct pilots and to develop recommendations and report to the FDA and to Congress to inform the rulemaking process for the rest of the of Section 204, or for enhanced record keeping requirements for high risk foods. This timeline template doesn't really show the length of time, and has these as even year intervals, but there has been some time between that 2012 report and the actual proposed rule. There's a variety of reasons for that, but the end of it is that in September of this year, FDA finally produced a proposed rule based on the recommendations in that report, as well as some other statutory considerations, which I'll get into in the next slide. For those of you that are not very familiar with U.S. regulatory processes, is that after Congress passes an act, the pertinent regulator will establish a proposed rule, and that will be subject to a comment period by the public. The federal entity will take in those comments and use that feedback into finalizing the rule, and then it will be finalized in the Federal Register. That's really the hypothetical big book where all the regulations go into in the federal government, and that will be and then it is then we'll have a period of a compliance window in which the industry prepares and gets ready to be subject to that rule. I am not a lawyer, so do not quote me completely on that, but that is the basic framework for how regulations are finalized in the United States. So the full name of this rule is the requirements for additional traceability records for certain foods, which I think you'll understand why I call it the food traceability rule and not its full name. I will also sometimes call it the FTR as well. But it really actually draws upon three acts. So which is why it's a somewhat of a misnomer to call it the Section 204 rule, because it does actually draw authority from other components. And I think that's actually really important to think about when you're thinking about the scope of this regulation and what it means for the food industry. So it also draws, as well as FSMA, it also draws on the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and also on the Public Health Services Act. What this really, one of the biggest takeaways from this is that its primary goal is to improve public health. Really thinking about in terms of foodborne illness and mitigating and preventing and improving the food safety system in regards to that particular challenge of the food supply system. It is also really focused on bettering the government's ability to respond to food safety emergencies so that they are better able to link records together and they're better able to respond. There also, though, is an implied and actually somewhat explicit goal within this regulation that it will move the industry forward in end-to-end traceability capabilities. So while it pertains to particular critical tracking events for particular foods on the food traceability list that were designated as high risk, it is hoped that this framework will be carried out across the food industry because its core concepts are so universal, and that the outputs are fairly easily measurable and practicable is a way to describe their chief reasoning for the structure of this rule. So I'm going to go over the rule as it's written before going into how it applies to GDST. This is kind of that there are actually a lot of similarities in vernacular and vocabulary. So I kind of figured it was easier to do this so that we're not necessarily conflating the two before we actually get into the alignment discussion. So it is a fairly robust regulation or proposed rule. There are several components which feed into each other. But as I said earlier, there's a lot of concepts that you'll be familiar with if you have been if you're familiar with the GDST 1.0 standards. So you have first and foremost is the food traceability list. They really describe it in terms of what are the foods that need to be tracked for this rule, more so than calling them high risk. It's really, and I'll go a little bit more detail on how they determine the FTL and what its actually end up meanings, but really it's what foods are, which foods pertain to this rule. Then they have defined critical tracking events and key data elements, fairly similar to data requirements that we have in the GDST. They define which CTEs are important for microbial and chemical contamination, and they have certain exemptions based on supply chain scenarios and food processing techniques. They have specified which key data elements are needed to be collected at those CTEs. This KDE list is, obviously a little bit shorter than the KDEs that are collected in GDST because they're really interested in being able to respond to food safety emergencies, and that's really the main goal. And then the last two are really kind of where the rubber meets the road regulation-wise. They want you to house your traceability program records in such a way that it is easily accessible and easily explainable, so that when the FDA needs to know when and where a product went, where it came from, or where it was distributed, that this can be easily understood by regulators. So when they are often receiving records in a traceback investigation, if it's without, context, it can be very difficult to link records together because you just don't know what the internal processes of record keeping are. And I'll go into further detail on what those records are. And then they have requirements about the turnaround time and the manner in which to and the manner in which you should give these records to the the FDA. I will say that there is an interesting development in the way that they have treated the entities that are subject to the rule. So they define it as persons rather than facilities or entities or organizations within it. And this is to help differentiate this regulation from how they regulate other, or how FDA regulated entities are treated under other FDA regulations. So persons is fairly broadly defined and can actually include individuals if they are subject to particular critical tracking events. There are also exemptions, which I'll go through at the very end, there's a whole list. There's a longer list of exemptions, but I will call out the ones that are the most, probably the most important to GDST members. So so to go into a little bit more depth on the food traceability rule, the food traceability list, they have a list of foods that they have developed through a complex process of both stakeholder inputs and also expert input as well, and a risk ranking research project by the FDA by CIFSAN. And I actually have this URL. I'll send out these resources after the webinar as well. But they actually have a webpage where you can go and look into this risk ranking model and see their justification fairly transparently. It's pretty interesting to see. But really what it means is they didn't just look at what foods are high risk, they also looked at the hazards associated with those foods and use that combination and the considerations on how foods are difficult to trace and track in a food safety emergency food safety emergency scenario as the basis for this. And I will go into which foods apply to seafood later on. But it's a fairly wide-ranging list. It includes things like shell eggs and soft cheeses and produce, and but yeah. So these are the FTR critical tracking events. I will go into more detail on these later, but it is a briefer list because they really are just interested in the CTEs that have been pertinent in the past to FDA traceback investigations. So namely growing, receiving, shipping. They do have a special type of receiving called first receiver, which I'll go into more depth later. Creation and transformation, which are similar, but it depends on the type of food that the regulation is pertaining to, whether it's a creation step or a transformation step. The important aspect is that these are the CTEs in which the traceability lot code must be associated with these CTEs. And this is a little bit more detail on the program records requirement. So it's really kind of funny because it is actually kind of a regulation to be organized. A lot of these records are already being kept, things such as bills of lading, purchase orders, production logs, but they want them to be organized in such a way that you can give these to the FDA in pertinent situations. They also want to have a list of foods that are subject to the FTL on which you handle, which includes identifiers and their descriptions. And they also really want details on how traceability lot codes are assigned. And I will go into more detail on the traceability lot code themselves and what they mean by that, because it is a specific definition in terms of this regulation versus what a lot code is generally thought about in a logistics context, in a food logistics context. And as I called out earlier, this is kind of what the overall compliance dates are. I will say that these are kind of like the minimum expectations. There is a possibility for further comment periods if they get a robust response. There could be a lengthening of deadlines. So these could be subject to change, but these are what FDA has outlined for compliance and what we are basing our timeline on until there is any change. But really the chief takeaway is after finalization of the rule, which is expected in March of 2021, there will be a 2-year window when it will, after the effective date, where compliance is expected. So I'm going to go into now the GDST FDA alignment. It's going to pretty much go into more detail on the food traceability rule. So it's going to kind of go in a little bit similar themes. So these are the foods that are on the food traceability list, which really I think are the most important to GDS team members. Other than retailers, obviously there's other products that will be that you will also be subject to. But for those that across the supply chain, these are going to be important commodities that you should be considerate of. So really, it's fairly broad. The only real call out and exemption that I saw was catfish, and that's just due to a regulatory quirk in the United States. Catfish is regulated by the USDA rather than the FDA, so it is not included within this regulation. But they have this description and these food categories. I think that these food categories are described further in other FDA regulations. I have not actually investigated really their entire scope on like a species or varietal basis. But this is what they have described in their literature and in the regulation itself. So I'm going to go over the CTEs and show you where the alignment is, and I'll give a little bit more detail on the FDA defined CTEs. So they have a growing CTE. This is really mainly aimed at produce. Produce is a specific called out food category within the food traceability rule. There's been several high profile traceback challenges with romaine lettuce and other leafy greens. But that does not mean it actually doesn't apply to aquaculture scenarios. It does from our reading of the rule. Really from the GDST critical tracking events definitions point of view, this is really farm harvest. The FDA CTE on growing is really interested in the commissioning of that or origination of that particular food stuff. And so that's really the CTE that aligns, and aligns pretty well definition wise. Receiving is almost identical to the GDST 1.0 CTE. There really isn't much to discuss there in the alignment. The one thing that is different is that they differentiate receiving and first receiving in the food traceability rule. Their definition for first receiver is the first person, and see here note that they describe the regulated organizations as persons. A first person other than the farm who purchases and takes physical possession of a listed food. So that really can be wide ranging. It's really it's really getting at, who is the first receiver, where enter is more, really goes from being a raw agricultural commodity to a supply chain system where it's turning into a consumer good, is I think really where they're trying to get to in this first receiver definition. So first receivers have additional KDEs depending on the food pertaining to, or the food involved. And in seafood, those actually have specific KDEs that the first receiver is responsible for that actually may pertain to on-vessel activities. So that there is a partial exemption for fishing vessels, but it is, as I said, it's a partial exemption. There is some expectation of record keeping that must be collected by the first receiver. So the responsibility is at first receiver, but the data will need to be collected upstream of them. We do have an entering commerce disposition in the GDST 1.0 guidance and standards, so which may be helpful in designating when a first receiver step is there. They also have this creation CTE in the FDA regulation or proposed rule. It doesn't really pertain to seafood products. There are certain FTL foods that are created rather than originated. So you don't grow peanut butter is created. FDA is not interested in the steps in growing and transporting and holding peanuts, they are only interested in the critical tracking events after it becomes peanut butter, or when it becomes peanut butter and after it becomes, after it goes subsequent to that transformation step. So it's really not relevant here for GDST CTE point of view, because the origination is either at wild caught harvest or at the growing step or the farm harvest step. And then they have transformation, which is fairly similar, a similar approach. We have given extensions to designate specific types of transformation events in the GDST 1.0 standard, but transformation is broadly defined and it in the food traceability rule, and it's just applying to where lot codes, the traceability lot code, it would have to be changed. So it includes processing, commingling, repacking, other manipulation of product. There is an exemption for commingling of raw agricultural commodities, which I'll get to at the very end of the presentation. And then lastly, shipping, very similar to our CTE ship. It's pretty much identical and self-explanatory. So now I'm going to go into the KDEs themselves. I'm really only going to concentrate on the first receiver and like the upstream steps. The downstream steps are make a lot of sense, and the alignment is pretty straightforward. Just a second here. So at the growing step, they do require growing area coordinates as a pertinent KDE that would align with the GDST. In the aquaculture scenarios, this KDE is pond location. Really the notation here is that FDA is expecting GPS coordinates, basically a geofence of sorts, to describe the growing area of terrestrial-based food origination. So, and this has a little bit of history to their approach in regulating produce, namely in the produce safety rule. So I apologize for the how large this table is at the first receiving step, but it is quite complicated. And I will kind of preface this in that I think that really this is where GDST is an asset in data collection and organization of seafood traceability events and your approach to meeting this regulation. So with the partial exemption in on fishing vessels, that responsibility on data collection is at first receiver. So that's why this list is so large compared to other CTEs defined by the proposed rule. And where event-based traceability may make it make your data management a little bit easier and less convoluted. But I will go kind of call out here on some of these KDEs to really show where the alignment is and where, if there is a deviation, where it has occurred. So they have the traceability lot code, and this is constant throughout, all of these CTEs, right? Where our linking KDE really corroborates quite well with this. We have a little bit less specificity and a little bit more flexibility in handling, in the designation of a traceability lot, or in this linking KDE, and whereas the FDA's traceability lot code is a little bit more narrowly defined. And that's kind of where that comment really alludes to, is that they have a very specific idea of what a TLC is, and it expects it to be used and collected and used to link records together. That is a really big chief takeaway of this regulation, is they've formed a basis for in a regulatory point of view of linking critical tracking events together through a product identifier and through a lot code. Additionally, we have things such as harvest date range associated with the wild caught event location, which here they actually want catch location to be collected at the first receiver associated with the first receipt of that product. And here they have proposed either the NMFS Ocean Geographic Code or GPS coordinates as the location information. They also want a location identifier. And this is in GDST, this is the location ID. They've proposed this identifier in the FDA regulation to either be the IMO number and or the fishing license ID. And I think this is where where having event-based traceability will make this somewhat easier, because if you're having a first receipt where you're having multiple vessels, this IMO or this location identifier list could get very large and be confusing, really, when you're not thinking about it in a when you're not discretizing these events upstream. You also need to have the country of license information as well. I've interpreted this as vessel flag. It's not necessarily as clear cut as that. Your vessel flag may differentiate or may be different from where your fishing license ID is. I'm not. This is something that we're continuing to look at and ask for clarification on. They also require an entry number, which is not a KDE in the GDST, which makes sense because this is a specific Customs and Border Patrol entry number specific to the United States. You can encode this in EPCIS, but it's not in the GDST Basic Universal List. Quantity, unit of measure, product identifiers are all very similar. Reference record number, this is bill of lading or invoice number. Like, this is kind of corroborates with that you know, approach where FDA wants companies to be organized about their traceability records. This is not something that's required in the Basic Universal List, but it is a EPCIS EBV attribute, so it can be also encoded in EPCIS. And then they also require transporter name and previous location identifier. And I have transshipment in here, but it really could mean, and you know, it depends on what the steps are in between the origination, the wild caught events, and the first receiver CTE. So on, you know, what actually applies here in the transporter name. So it could be, from my interpretation of it, it could be transshipment vessel potentially, or it also could be the transporter that is taking it from landing to the first receiver. So that is kind of a little bit more, it's more supply chain contingency dependent. So yeah, so when we're looking at transformation, it's very similar. And again, as I was talking about, the FDA is just really interested in the need to know information for being able to enable in order to respond to food safety emergencies. So it's a fairly brief list here, really concentrated on being able to link the records, to link the input quantities to the outputs, so that it can denote and link those records together. Sorry. And I will kind of point out here, I have this like asterisk at the end. So what they often do in order to link records together is require previous identifiers of product and of locations for previous CTEs into the data collection at the subsequent CTE, so that thereby those records are interlinked together. That's where, rather than have that long thing, you know, in each comment, I just have the asterisk there. Shipment, it's also very similar, and we've already kind of gone through all of these KDEs, but there is wide alignment on our data requirements in the GDST 1.0 and what is required in the food traceability rule. And I want to especially call out the traceability lot code specifically. So we have a structure, we have a URN or URI structure for identifiers, both using a GS1 identifier and a non-GS1 alternative in particular scenarios, for, you know, structuring the product identifier along with the lot code. And so that can be very, very helpful in meeting this requirement. The food traceability rule defines traceability lot as a lot of food that has been originated, transformed, or created. Although I feel like they should follow the rules of a definition and not use the word, one of the words in the definition, but essentially they're defining it as a traceability lot, is pertaining to these specific CTEs, and it doesn't pertain to other CTEs. That's what is a very important aspect of this regulation. So it only wants the TLC to be defined and associated with origination, transformation, and creation events. In events that pertain to the rule, but that are not those, that means that lot code should not be changed or cannot. So for instance, if you're in a particular shipping event, like a 3PL, for instance, may assign a master lot code to on top of lots that they receive, and that is not allowed within this rule unless you are accompanying those traceability lot codes with that master lot code in the information that you're providing to your customer. So and then it also defines what the traceability lot code is itself. It's a descriptor which actually identifies the traceability lot code. It does not specify how it should be structured. It talks about what common practices are, but that is also important that that's expecting a code that I will say that it does talk about unique identification and lot definitions. It does not get into more specifics around global unique identification. And that is an area that probably would benefit of having a little bit more clarification in the regulation to ensure that global uniqueness occurs so that there isn't the possibility of collision of identifiers, especially at the end of the supply chain. And then I'm going to go through some important exemptions. And some of these have to do with provisions within the Food Safety Modernization Act, and some of these are also just with realities of implementation, what some challenges may be. As with other aspects of the Food Safety Modernization Act, there are exemptions for small organizations, really individuals or companies or entities that really have a low level of revenue that are not really as commercially relevant. So under this rule is if your revenue is under $25,000 a year in a 3-year period. Now, I think this has some implications when you're thinking about its applicability in a global sense. I think that there can be organizations that would be technically exempt under this that may still be relevant because of where it is originating from. As I talked earlier, there's a partial exemption for commingled raw agricultural commodities. So really the steps from origination to when it enters the supply chain to be developed into or processed into a consumer packaged good, there is some exemptions for the commingling of product in those upstream events. There still needs to be some chain of custody from what I can tell, but it is not, the KDE collection is not as robust and that's why it's a partial exemption. There's also a partial exemption. There's 2 options for small retail food establishments, and this is defined as those that have under 10 FTEs. There's the partial exemption for food from fishing vessels. I kind of went into this already, but there's some data that are required from fishing vessels, but they are not required to keep records, if that makes sense. So they're not, the actual fishers are not responsible for keeping these records and holding these records, but the first receivers do require that information and are expected to have those in their records, which kind of means that these fishing vessels are required to keep the information because they wouldn't be able to participate in the supply chain if they're not able to provide that information, and the first receiver is not able to do their due diligence to be compliant with the regulation. And there is an important kill step exemption, which really goes into some of the food safety considerations of the rule. If you perform a kill step, which is from a food microbiology point of view, this is a 5 log reduction in potential microbial load. It's anything like, think about processes like pasteurization or heat treatments or irradiation or food processing techniques to reduce the potential microbial contamination. If that has occurred, then CTEs subsequent to that kill step are not required to have these enhanced record keeping requirements. And I put in here one of the slides directly from the FDA to show them how they envision the enforcement and the compliance with this regulation. So it starts with at the fishing vessel. As I said earlier, there's like a partial exemption here. The buyer is the first receiver here. So they have the receiving CTEs that they must keep, and they have the shipping CTEs that they must keep. Those shipping KDEs are basically mirrored in the seafood processor. That's really how you are linking these entities together, for the purposes of this regulation. The seafood processor transforms that product, and then it ships those onward to the distributor, and the retailer is required to keep information as well of the receipt of that product. There is not regulation on to the consumer level or steps after the receipt at retailer. So yeah, so that was a brief overview. There is a lot to this regulation, and I did kind of go over a little bit more than I meant to, but I would like to kind of go into what your guys' initial thoughts are in its applicability, and so these are just kind of some suggested topic areas of discussion. I know there was a couple comments, I haven't looked at them yet, so let me look at those really quick. So I did get one question about what makes me think that publication in the Federal Register will occur March of 2021. That is just the date that they have outlined after. So comments are due January 21st from stakeholders, and then finalization in the Federal Register is 60 days subsequent to that. So that is what where that date comes from. So that was all of the questions that were in the chat. But yeah, so I don't know if there's any initial thoughts that we want to go through, any questions that occurred that you'd like to talk through.
This is Mike Kraft with Bumblebee. A quick confirmation from your angle. As I read it, there is not a small vessel harvest type of aggregating ability as there is in SIMP. Do you read that similarly, so that this is a number of these things are a bit inconsistent with the current SIMP rule? I mean, obviously, not only the scope of the species covered, but also specifically the small vessel harvest, which SIMP allows for aggregated landing points. This does not appear to provide that sort of exemption, and applies it that there needs to be unique or vessel identification down to the vessel itself. Is that how you interpret this as well?
I do interpret this that way as well. I think that is a big reason why I think it strengthens really the case for using GDST. It's because when you have, event-based traceability to the vessel, you're able to generate the information necessary to meet different regulatory requirements. I do feel that, not to speak on behalf of the FDA, that it is, I do feel that they know that there is this traceability regulation for catch legality that's applicable from another regulator in the federal government. I would like them to have that discussion in the regulation itself, or at least in some guidance documentation, because especially for the first receiver, they're going to be having considerations in both of these domains. And I think that it is, and because seafood is such a highly called out, general category of foods that apply to the food traceability rule, I think some explicit mention and clarification on the differences and the similarities between SIMP compliance and this rule the food traceability rule compliance, you know, where those exist.
Hey Tom, this is Justin with the Fishing Company. I wonder if you could comment really quickly on some of the other interpretations we've seen indicated that the warehousing in the U.S. would have a greater burden on and through this process than they have on the others. It basically, the way their other groups are interpreting it is that an importer basically has no function within this rule, and that traceability would happen at a warehouse or distributor, not at the importer. Does that make sense to you, or do you think that's a misinterpretation? Or?
No, that's an appropriate interpretation. Well, it depends. So the rule really concentrates on who is physically holding the food. So, you know, who is physically in possession of the food. Because, you know, again, the scope is really to be able to actionate and to speedily actionate upon, you know, dangers to the public in terms of, you know, a contamination event. So that's why there may be additional burden on warehousing than previously. Now, there are provisions, though, that you can designate others to, such as an importer, to keeping the records for you. So just because you are physically holding the food doesn't mean that those records need to be kept, and that arrangement needs to be clear, and you need to be able to access those records in an appropriate fashion. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the warehousing is, going to have to undergo an additional burden of record keeping if they have an appropriate record keeper associated with that. I'm not sure how that may apply in more complex scenarios. I think that is an area where there could be, but in general, I think that is where there's going to be the most change and the most challenge is in warehousing and holding of foods. I think for processors and for retailers, this is very welcome, and it's not going to meaningfully change a lot of their approaches, but to more of the intermediary components of the supply chain, there is going to be quite a bit of change in business processes, especially in the treatment of the how traceability lot codes are used for tracing and tracking product in those intermediate steps between origination and transformation and receipt.
That does bring up the other question I had was on lot code, how the lot codes are handled in this regulation. It seems like they're trying to apply a lot of changes to how lot codes are handled and trying to spread them out, so that a single lot code is used across more of the supply chain, which is pretty difficult the way things are structured now. Do you have any other details on that, or have they given any clarification yet on how that's supposed to look?
Yeah, and I think that is really the core of the regulation. I mean, the KDE CTE structure is very helpful for thinking about this regulation and for carrying it out. But really, the core of where they're really mandating change is in this traceability lot code allocation, and where it can apply and where it can't apply. And I do think that there is going to be meaningful change to many organizations in the way that they handle lot codes. And that is purposeful on the FDA's part. When they have conducted traceback investigations, often the choke points are not those that are regularly, or are not really those that are more familiar with FDA regulation or food safety regulation. I mean, those that are like in processing environments, et cetera, but it's really kind of those intermediaries where that information is difficult to retrieve or difficult to interpret and to be able to link records together, and thereby endangering the public's health. So it really is going to be a significant change. And I think in terms of clarification on the TLC, I am not expecting them to really give much more other than the requirements on which CTEs they apply for, which conditions you cannot assign a new lot code. In terms of like actually developing a TLC and what that should look like, they don't have specificity into that. I think they have referenced global standards as a as a useful tool, but because of provisions in the Food Safety Modernization Act and other statutes as well, they cannot necessarily prescribe specific technologies. And I have been on the I have been of the mindset that they haven't specified specific like data fields and how to generate lot codes, because to them they've interpreted that as prescribing a specific technology or favoring a specific technology over the others. So that's why they have this. I mean, they do have the requirement that you need to be able to tell FDA how you allocate your traceability lot codes, how they're assigned, how they're associated with, product identifiers, et cetera. But they don't have really more explicit definition in what a TLC should look like. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yeah, I think so. It's still unclear, but I think that's because they were still unclear about it.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of a balance between very specific requirements and fairly vague requirements. And I think they're working around some limitations. I was actually a bit surprised that they were even able to require an electronic spreadsheet as an output, because even that may be not burdensome, but it might be prescribing a particular technology. I think it's a technology as basic as paper at this point, but it's still that is still a level of digitization that isn't always seen in a FSMA context. So, I mean, I also encourage those on the line to look at the document that I've sent around, which is that technical. It really is a lot of the alignment that I showed you earlier. It is a fairly complex regulation, and if there are certain scenarios that clarification would be helpful and you would like our further analysis on, feel free to reach out to me and use that document kind of as a guide for structuring your thinking. I would really welcome it. It is, as I said earlier, it's about 200 pages. If you put it in a Word document in the weird 3-column Federal Register structure, it's 3 columns, or with 3 columns that it's still 130 or so. So it's pretty dense. There's a lot of definitions in there, a lot of technical information, and some of it is written a little bit unclearly because of the structures that they're confined to in trying to develop a federal regulation. It would be nice if they could use, like, for instance, like a KDE-CT matrix like we have in the GDST, which would really help clarify a lot of this, but they just basically have to write it out in a kind of a narrative form with a specific language type. So it can kind of be a little bit confusing translating that to technical requirements. Well, with that, thanks for the questions. Really appreciate you guys, listening to me delve into U.S. federal regulation. We do see a wide, we see quite some implications for this, and honestly, it seems like a pretty straightforward approach to regulating end-to-end food traceability. And I do, at least personally, as a food traceability scientist, I see it as being a basis for regulations in other national governments as well. The approach really ensures that there is linking of CTEs together, And it also is something that doesn't require specific technologies. It's, you know, it's technology agnostic, but it also solves and resolves challenges for national governments in supply chain visibility for various, you know, for specific use cases, especially food safety, but also maybe, you know, legality of seafood. So we do see this having implications beyond the US market and really spurring and accelerating food traceability in general. I can, you know, because of this method, that really kind of should cement the KDE CTE concept and the use of global standards in the mindset of all those in the supply chain, including those upstream. So overall, pretty excited from the Secretariat's point of view and seeing a regulation that aligns so well. I think there are areas of clarification which would be very beneficial, especially when you get into complex supply chains such as in seafood. And, you know, there are quite a few KDEs required at first receiver where there are, you know, there may be specific pertinent information that might be at different events, which I think is still very much strengthens the use of GDST for those contexts. But again, thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or any of the other members of the Secretariat. I will also send a follow-up email with some links to the FDA's website. They have a great interactive website on explaining the rule in more detail. They've got examples. I'll also send that risk ranking model that's created by one of the research offices of FDA, and you know, and then I'll also send out this deck as well. I'll send that out tomorrow or maybe Friday after I've done the Asia Pacific webinar. So I can just send it to the entire list. Thank you. I appreciate your guys' time.
Thank you, Tom. It's a lot of great information.